find out, or something like that. Anyway, dark thoughts. One who was not so lucky, however, was Bobby Franks. They happened across him by the side of the road and instantly decided that the plan was back on. Franks was an easy target on account of the fact that he knew Loeb and it'd be easy to coerce him to a kidnapping. On top of that, they knew that his father was very wealthy. So Leopold pulled alongside Bobby and Loeb spoke to him through the backseat window. He offered him a ride, which Bobby politely declined, seeing as he was only about 5 minutes from home. A businessman Loeb changed his tune, saying that he wanted to chat to him about a tennis racket, which was enough to draw the sport-loving Bobby in. With the unwitting victim in the passenger seat, Leopold drove off again. At the first opportunity, Loeb grabbed his weapon, the chisel, and leaned over and cut Bobby's mouth and brought the handle smashing down onto the back of the boy's skull. Bobby struggled as he was struck in the head 3 more times, spinning around to face his attacker and crying out all the while. Even after 4 hits, Bobby continued to groan, something which Loeb hadn't anticipated. The reality of ending life was far less clean-cut than in its detective novels. So he dragged the victim to the back seat, forced a rag into his mouth, and taped it shut. It was like that Bobby Franks slowly passed away in the back seat of the car. Leopold claimed in his confession that the victim died instantly of suffocation shortly thereafter, which is an inherently nonsensical sentence. That is horrible. At first, the two killers had given conflicting accounts of who actually killed Bobby, with each blaming the other. However, their stories converged more after that. They told of how the boy was covered with a blanket while they proceeded onwards to Indiana, a total journey of around 25 miles. I feel even if they're in concert so much, I know modern law would label, at least in the UK, I believe in the US as well, it would label them both as murderers because they were acting in consort. Like, I believe there are gang laws that mean people are guilty like that, not 100% sure. But, I mean, you don't need to shift the blame. You're both going to be guilty of murder, guys. Come on now. They stopped along the way to throw Bobby's shoes into a bush, removing his trousers and socks and putting them back in the car. Now all that was left to do was wait until dark. They cruised around the countryside and stopped in at a sandwich shop for dinner and root beers. It was as if they didn't have the body of a kid sitting in their car at all. Once twilight came, they travelled onwards to the dumping point they had chosen weeks before. Originally, they planned to kill their victim with an ether-soaked rag once there, but he was already dead long before he arrived. At the site, they removed the rest of Bobby's clothes and poured the hydrochloric acid on his face in an attempt to cover up his identity. Some reports mentioned that the same was done to his genitals, as the fact that he was circumcised could help the police identify the victim as Jewish, although neither culprit mentioned this in his confession. Then, they pushed him headfirst into the railway culvert, leaving half the body clearly visible. Leopold attempted to shove it further inside with his foot. We can take a little bit of satisfaction over the image of the pair of horn-rimmed glasses slipping out of his pocket as he did so. Meanwhile, Loeb went off to wash his hands on the other side of the tracks. They then set off homeward. This was at about 9 p.m. On the way, they stopped at a drugstore to check the address of their victim. Leopold called his parents to let them know that it'd be late. It was he who, on returning to Chicago, called the Franks household under the George Johnson alias. This was to be the start of an elaborate hunt which would distract the attention of the family and investigators and satisfy the killer's craving for mystery novel drama. It's pretty clear that Loeb's noir novel-filled imagination played a big part in cooking up this part of the plan. I mean, the final step was for the father to toss an envelope containing $10,000 from a moving train near Lake Michigan, with the two waiting in a car to collect it. Thankfully, the family were spared taking part in that futile little game, although it's not much consolation given the circumstances. After Leo and Loeb put things in motion by mailing the ransom note, they turned their attention to the bloodstains in the rental car. They cleaned it up as much as possible, buried the clothes in Loeb's furnace, and then headed over to Leopold's house to hang out with his family as if nothing had happened, waiting for their elaborate scheme to unfold. But as we know, the whole thing fell apart faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. It didn't start off terribly. The note arrived at the Franks household, but there were a few other pieces to set up before they could topple the dominoes that would lead them to the $10,000. First, the car. It was still very clearly bloodstained. While the pair tried to scrub it clean in Leopold's garage, the chauffeur came down to offer a hand. They were able to send him off with a story about spilling red wine. We've all been there, right? Cruising around, drinking Pinot Noir straight from the bottle until some idiot breaks in front of you. In the end, the majority of the visible staining could be removed, despite the close call. Again, just reiterating how these guys are terrible at crime. After that, they drove downtown with a series of typewritten notes that would direct to the treasure hunt. They tried to take one inside a trash can, but it wouldn't hold, so instead they went straight to the train station. Loeb disguised himself in a hat, glasses, and black overcoat. He bought a ticket to Philadelphia solely for the purpose of hiding a note on the train. It instructed Mr. Franks to move to the back of the train and watch until he saw a red brick factory with the name Champion painted on the outside. After waiting a few seconds, he was to toss the boxed up cash as far eastward as possible. While Loeb planted this final instruction, Leopold was setting the whole convoluted sequence in motion. He called a taxi to the Franks' house and called them to direct the father to a downtown drugstore where he would receive another call on a payphone. Honestly, it seems like a completely unnecessary step when they already had him on the phone at that very moment, but I guess I'm just not a criminal genius, indeed. It was around that point, at around 2:30 in the afternoon, that the duo had the first inclination that maybe they weren't so good at this crime business either. Driving past a newsstand, they caught sight of a front page headline: Boy's body found in swamp. It had been less than 24 hours since they disposed of the body, and it had already been found. Regardless, Leopold demanded they keep on with the whole charade. They tried calling the drugstore, but as we already know, poor Mr. Franks had forgotten the address. His pain at thinking he let his son down was cut off by a deeper pain. The police identified the body that afternoon. For Leopold and Loeb, it meant the little game was over. They decided just to return the car and head home. Loeb's chauffeur told him about the murder when he arrived, and the pair's anxiety started to build. They began discussing what to do with questions and set about destroying the last of the evidence. The typewriter was tossed in the harbour and its barhead scattered into a river in the park. The blankets they doused in gasoline and burned in an alleyway. But there was one key piece of evidence they couldn't destroy. In the newspaper, they saw the police had found a distinctive pair of glasses near the body, and the heat was really on. Now our two narratives have neatly tied together. We understand exactly how this horrible crime took place, every detestable little detail. Awful and horrible, yes, but could you really call this the perfect crime? Objectively, no. In fact, the whole thing displays about as much genius as your average corner store robbery. I don't mean to be crass, but surely if two huge intellects planned the crime of the century for months, they could come up with a better method than smacking someone with a chisel. And all of that planning, only for Leopold to drop his glasses, undone by the same Achilles heel as Velma from Scooby-Doo. Add to that all the blood over the rental car, cleaning the car at their own home, the shoddy concealment of the body, and the amount of people who the two revealed their faces to while scoping out the school, and you hardly have the portrait of two master criminals. And that's just mentioning a few of the things, not to mention the typewriter with the matching letters. It's like, yeah, you got rid of the typewriter, but you've written a whole lot of stuff on there. It's going to be matched up. Could it really be that these two weren't geniuses at all, but a couple of bumbling sadists with good school report cards? I mean, there's a reason why crime shows don't usually feature a diabolical ornithologist as the villain. Murder and birdwatching are two distinct fields with very different skill sets. At the end of the day, Leopold and Loeb were well out of their depth, just two garden variety narcissists living out delusions of grandeur. Well, that's my take on the story anyway. The media at the time, however, spun plenty of different yarns about what might have caused the horrible crime to take place. This was the early days of true mass media, when radios had just started finding their way into millions of American households. Everyone had an opinion and an agenda to push with it. The airwaves and papers were filled with all kinds of speculation. For example, some ran with the idea that the crime was the inescapable result of the new culture of libertinism which had swept over the American youth. Churches, synagogues, and traditional values were having a hard time competing against jazz bars and casual sex. It's hard to imagine why. Evangelist Billy Sunday was one such proponent. He rallied against the moral miasma of the youth of the day and their infidel minds. Likewise, an unnamed individual referred to only as a Jewish spokesman wrote in the Chicago Tribune that rich Jewish parents were to blame for letting their children grow up spoiled and without any values. And of course, once news of the sexual dynamic between the two culprits came to light, this was taken as evidence of moral corruption. Now remember, this was the 1920s. Plenty of folks were on the lookout for chances to bash rich Jewish people, gay people, and atheism. I'll not be participating in any of that because I haven't lost my mind. My aim is to give you a sense of the kind of media frenzy that was whipped up around this case. The idea of the American dream itself was being put to the test. After all, two of its model families had produced offspring no better than the poor folk who were rotting in prison. Various academics were rallied to try and explain the whole thing. Psychologists attached significance to the fact that Leopold had already been sexually abused by his governess, that's nanny for our UK listeners, although I feel like Americans would also say nanny as well these days. Governess feels very old-fashioned. There were even graphics published in the papers featuring analyses of Leopold and Loeb's skull shapes. Is it phrenology? The science of people feeling your skull to see what's up inside, and it's all lies. Why is that important? Well, there's another one pseudoscience called phrenology. Oh, Callum and I, same page, and I'm quite pleased that I remember that it was called phrenology, which claims that it was possible to determine a person's psychological character just by looking at the shape of their head. I'll give a quick rundown of Leopold's for any phrenology fans listening in. The slope of his brow meant that he lacked benevolent power. The tops of his ears revealed a distinctive instinct. His lips were sensuous. I think maybe psychologist needed to go take a cold shower. Yeah, it's just all bullshit, really. The trial. Against this backdrop of media sensationalism, the Cook County State Attorney was tasked with achieving the harshest possible punishment for both Leopold and Loeb. Death penalty, for sure. This was Robert Crowe, a Republican Party man with mayoral aspirations. He saw his shot to gain the goodwill of the public with a swift death penalty ruling. He was pretty confident that he could pull it off. In fact, Crowe told the papers this was potentially the most complete case he ever presented to a grand or petit jury. Wait, are they pleading not guilty? I assume they confess. So I assume they're going for non-guilty. So is there a jury in the US in that case? What does the judge just make? Does the judge just sentence? Or maybe in death penalty cases, I don't know, but maybe this is correct that there is a jury to decide what punishment is dished out. Or maybe in the US, does the jury decide how long you go to prison for? I thought that was the judge's job. Anyway, I'll stop talking because I don't know what I'm talking about. When the defense counsel for Leopold and Loeb was revealed, however, Crowe surely wished he had dialed down bravado. This was Clarence Darrow, a legendary name in American legal circles, and likely one to ring some bells even for the casual true crime listener. Darrow and Crowe had gone head to head before on a corruption case featuring a senior Republican, with Darrow ultimately coming out on top. The trial, which started in July, was all set up to be a major courtroom drama, the kind of which the American public eats right up to this day. Local radio station WGN even considered setting up mics in the courthouse to broadcast the whole thing live, but decided that it would be in poor taste. Yes, it would be in poor taste. Fast forward 70 years and the whole nation would be gawking at the OJ trial, popcorn in hand. I'll let you decide which setup is better. Oh yeah, okay. So you can have like cameras and stuff in US courtrooms. In the UK, I don't believe you can. And so there's sketch artists who will draw what's going on, and that appears in the paper rather than actual photos and stuff like that. But unlike in the OJ trial, nobody even considered exoneration as an option. I mean, the two killers had given confessions over 30 pages long and were openly proud of what they had done. No lawyer on earth was going to spin that into a not guilty. For Clarence Darrow, the bar was set much lower. Success meant avoiding the death penalty. Of course, when it came time to enter a plea, both Leopold and Loeb admitted their guilt. This allowed them to completely bypass trial by jury. Okay, good. I thought that was the case. I'm glad that we have the facts here, which would have massively swung things in the state's favour. Instead, Darrow only needed to appeal to the judge himself. All he had to do was convince the judge that Leopold and Loeb suffered from mental health problems rather than full-blown insanity, which would be enough to win life in prison. I think that should be achievable. And if this is a very good lawyer, that seems very likely. Because there's that lack of motive, the trust fund, rich kids, just got nothing better to do, spoiled. They're screwed up guys. There's no one who could argue that they're not screwed up guys. Just can that lawyer spin that screwed upness into mental issues? I believe probably yes. I don't know. I don't know the outcome of this one. So both sides rolled out psychiatrists to give conflicting explanations for the same evidence, which caused a backlash against the field in the papers. The defense played every card in their hand, even arguing that the pressures of being from a wealthy family had caused the two teens to act out against their life of privilege. Man, being rich must be so tough. They painted a picture of both men as fanaticists. Leopold as a self-aggrandizing servant, desperate to worship and serve Loeb, while Loeb imagined himself as a criminal genius with need for someone to applaud him. As evidence, one of the psychological profilers quoted a conversation that he had with Loeb when he